And welcome back. Now, yesterday, Corruption Watch released a report on youth perceptions and attitudes towards corruption in South Africa. According to Stats SA's 2019 mid-year estimate, youth aged between 18 and 34 they actually make up a total of 18 million of the population, and that represents almost a third of South Africa's entire population. Unemployment, low or no income, the abuse of power with expectations of sexual favours were cited as some of the main drivers of corruption. Most respondents hold the view that South African police services, or the SAPS, as well as local government officials, are the most corrupt institutions in South Africa. Corruption Watch project coordinator Sabeehah Motala, social activist Dominic Brown, and political activist Mzwandile Banjathwa join us now to discuss these findings further. Thanks so much to all of you for being with us here on Morning Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sabeehah, let me start with you. Firstly, what was the intention of the survey, and looking at our South African society and how it is stratified, who were you targeting in that sample of 1,500 respondents?
So the aim of the survey was to kind of verify a hypothesis that we had based on reports that we'd received of corruption in education, in the traffic and licensing department and municipalities that we kind of thought relate more to youth. So the idea of the survey, which as you said surveyed 1,500 respondents between the ages of 18 and 35, which was also weighted geographically by gender and by race, the aim was to kind of see if this hypothesis was correct. And as it turns out, these have been, so employment, licensing and education have been some of the standout areas where corruption is affecting young people as per the survey results.
Now, Dominic, you're a youth activist. What do the youth generally say about corruption in South Africa?
When you think about corruption or any issues, you think about how it impacts your immediate existence. So it doesn't come as a surprise that many youth will relate corruption to the very local and immediate issues that they face. But I think that I would like to add additional reflections on that. I think that we cannot just look at the immediate. I think we also need to contextualize the issue of corruption. And of course, many of the people interviewed and surveyed are unemployed or very low income, and this is a snapshot of most of the youth in the country, which, as you say, makes up most of the population. So in an unemployment crisis and a corruption crisis, government is looking to deal with corruption by increased budget cuts to infrastructure and essential services, and the further privatization of public services. But the irony is that the private sector is equally corrupt, and this is what's not really reflected. So if you consider, one, the news report that you guys aired today, that 1,500 company directors received the social relief of distress grant. I mean, it's insane, but that's the tip of the iceberg. 30 to 40% of the public procurement budget is lost to the private sector due to inflated prices and fraud. During the pandemic period, of 139 companies awarded PPE contracts, completely evaded paying any taxes at all, according to SARS. When we look at the level of illicit financial flows as a result of large transnational corporations shifting profits out of the country, that's more than 100 billion rand lost in revenue each year. So one, we have to consider the issue of private sector corruption, and two, government strategy to address corruption will only exacerbate the unemployment crisis and the crisis of social services in this country.
A political activist, Mzwandile, if you look at what youth are saying, as Dominic was expressing there, and also the fact that corruption by government officials is so glaring with all the reports at our disposal, annual reports exposing billions of rands worth of corruption, and it's become a pandemic in and of itself. How do you then deal with the politics of things and how the youth have to respond to this, but also try to put their best foot forward in the society?
Yeah, I think the one thing that is quite interesting about the reports that Corruption Watch has released is that it also highlights not only how young people are victims of corruption, but in some instances how young people are also perpetrators of corruption as well. We are beginning to now see most young people beginning to infiltrate most of the political spaces. And with that, the attitude of the old, they still carry with them. We are seeing a lot of a change, I suppose, and more youth representation in some of the government structures. But where young people are, there isn't a significant change in attitudes towards corruption. So I think that needs to be worked on really, and really needs to be looked into by young people.
So just getting back to Sabeehah with regard to the survey and the fact that some respondents say that they are routinely asked for sexual favours, especially when it comes to job seeking. How much agency do the youth actually have when it comes to negotiating these circumstances?
So this issue of sextortion has been a recent and interesting one in the anti-corruption movement globally. Transparency International in the past year or so for the first time has started collecting data on sextortion as a form of corruption and also gender disaggregated data. So this is why it has been included in this study and hopefully in future studies that we do. It's a form of corruption that isn't always kind of recognized and spoken about because we commonly understand that money or some kind of financial resource or tangible resource is exchanged in a corrupt transaction, whereas here we have a body that is kind of exchanged as a currency of corruption. The report has shown also that it disproportionately affects women and gender non-conforming people. So I think it speaks to the dynamics of our country where we have this patriarchal attitudes, patriarchal society that devalues certain people based on their gender. And I think in terms of agency, we're living in a country where young people are hugely unemployed. And as you said earlier, make up such a huge portion of the population. And so agency is quite difficult. You kind of have this low supply of jobs and a huge demand for jobs. And therefore, young people are extremely vulnerable to corruption. And unfortunately, women and gender non-conforming people are particularly vulnerable to sextortion as a form of corruption in exchange for employment.
Is it only women and gender non-conforming people, Sabeehah? Because I was wondering about that with regard to sextortion, whether young men are also exposed to that and at the receiving end of it.
Yeah, according to the survey results, both men and women responded to say that they had, I think it was 31% of respondents in total had said that they had been asked for sexual favors in exchange for something. But women are more than twice as likely to be asked for a sexual favor. And gender non-conforming people, despite being a really tiny proportion of the study, also demonstrated a huge vulnerability to corruption, particularly in terms of avoiding arrest. This isn't necessarily arrest because they are gender non-conforming people, but arrest for whatever reason. But it really demonstrates kind of the social attitudes that exist in society towards certain vulnerable groups.
Dominic, the study also found that some of the main drivers of corruption are, of course, unemployment, as Mzwandile pointed out earlier. You talk about the abuse of power, of greed. There's the issue of low or no income amongst the youth. With the respondents and what they said in response to the questions that were put to them in the survey, do you find on the ground that young people justify, or do they not justify corruption? Because as Mzwandile was pointing out earlier, because corruption is so systemic, it's ingrained in our society, in our DNA. Young people are now themselves more likely to perpetrate corruption. So do you find that they are justifying it at the moment?
I think that young people and poor people, as most people, know the difference between right and wrong. And I don't think that anyone would easily justify any forms of corruption. But I find it interesting that most of the emphasis is placed on the poor and the marginalized, who may steal a loaf of bread to feed their family one night, whereas you have these very, very rich individuals who are stealing so much more, and that can be used to ensure a better life for people, so that the choice between right and wrong is a choice people can actually make. So that's the first point. So I think we have to shift the debate from the poor and the youth unemployed being the biggest perpetrators of corruption. The biggest perpetrators is the private sector and its big state officials. Secondly, I think that if we want to deal with corruption and unemployment effectively, the minimum to do is to have, one, increased transparency with all transactions, procurements, employment contracts, everything. But secondly, and fundamentally, we need an implementation of a universal basic income grant. It's incredible that we have so much poverty, unemployment, and inequality in such a rich country. And we can pay for this basic income grant through the implementation of a wealth tax. You will see very few people stealing a loaf of bread or engaging in petty instances of corruption. And we won't have to lambaste the poor for trying to feed themselves and their families in the way that we're doing now. But moreover, we need a break from the current macroeconomic policy that creates situations of corruption, which is really a public-private partnership. We need to ensure that we build state capacity through financing key state institutions, whether it be the SABC or whether it be the National Prosecuting Authority or the South African Revenue Services and all other statutory bodies, building the infrastructure at local government levels. These will create jobs and provide services, and it will be able to address the people who are really corrupt, the big private sector who can make a choice between right and wrong, and who also know the difference, but choose wrong at the expense of the majority of South Africans. I feel it very unfair to lambaste the poor working class for petty corruption. I'm sorry.
Mzwandile, do you feel that the youth are able to sufficiently distinguish or make the association between the abuse and the squandering of resources in relation to the impact that this could have on their own lives?
Yeah, I think young people do, and the report highlights that very clearly, because it also says that young people not only understand corruption and how it permeates, but also the impact it has on society and in the country at large. And I think what now needs to happen is that young people need to start coming together and forming coalitions that would sustain anti-corruption measures. And for the greatest of all times, young people have taken a back seat, particularly in the new democracy. And I think with next year's local government elections around the corner, it's very important that young people start to look at all of these structures and available opportunities where their voices could now be heard. I mean, there's an opportunity for independent candidates to begin to mobilize and sort of have a solid voice outside of the mundane structures of politics.
Which is very interesting, because I'd like to hear from all of you in closing what you think are the key takeaways from this report, firstly, and also if you were to just encourage young people, you know, how to deal with corruption and safeguard themselves to a certain extent against its effects, and also from becoming perpetrators of this moving forward, what would you say? What sort of advice would you dispense? Sabeehah, let me start with you.
So I think one of the key takeaways of this report is really a demonstration of economic inequality in this country. Just to go back to an earlier point that we were talking about in terms of the willingness of young people to participate, it's very interesting that when asked this question, high-income respondents to the survey showed that they were more likely to participate in corruption, or more willing to participate in corruption in the future. And I think this speaks to economic opportunity in this country as an access factor to even corruption. So we need to be rethinking our economic structure soon, very urgently, to kind of address unemployment, corruption, a whole host of issues plaguing young people in South Africa. Advice I would give to young people is there's a lot of information that's available to the public that can be used to kind of hold our leadership accountable. As Mzwandile said, there's opportunity for mobilization, for getting together and talking about these issues, for advocating for change. And I think that as the future is kind of needs to change for the good of young people, it is in their hands and our hands to kind of start being louder, letting our voices be heard, and mobilizing and marching if we have to for change, for a better economic future.
We have to say goodbye to our SABC 2 viewers in about 3 minutes. So Mzwandile and Dominic, if both of you could just maybe take a minute and a half to give us your closing sentiments. Dominic?
Thank you to everyone. I think for me, the key takeaway is definitely the massive inequalities, and that young people connect the issue of inequalities to the issue of corruption. I think it's important that we speak to young people and that their voices are heard. But ultimately, I think to be able to address corruption effectively, we don't need to fight over the crumbs. People deserve a dignified life, and there's a lot of money in this country to provide it. And the rich are the ones who are corrupt, not the poor.
Well, that's Dominic and Mzwandile, your parting shot.
Look, I think young people should also re-look at how they interact both with the state and with big business. We should be cautious at all times. But I think now is the time that young people should stop waiting for the door to be open for them. It's about time that we start kicking these doors open. I mean, it doesn't make sense that you still have the lowest representation in parliament of young people, that you have the lowest representation of young people in all the high decision-making echelons of this country. It makes no sense whatsoever. This is an issue that young people need to battle with, and we need to see how is it and where do we kick these doors.
Well, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much to all three of you for engaging us and discussing the Corruption Watch study, which sought to understand the perceptions of South Africa's youth and their views on rampant corruption in the country in relation to their lives. And speaking to us there were Corruption Watch project coordinator Sabeehah Motala, social activist Dominic Brown, and political activist Mzwandile Banjathwa. And thanks to all of them. We're going to just quickly recap on a few of our responses to the question.